We've even spoken this theology, I'm sure, as a parent. Don't worry, mommy's here. Don't worry, daddy's got you. This year when we have been in pandemic and we have all been in distress and war, we have understood the necessity of this theology of with. Some of you have shared that the sustaining moment is that moment after our worship service where we all unmute ourselves and greet each other. Sometimes it's responding to the joys and sorrows that you post in the chat. For many of us, it has been our small group experiences. Sometimes those small group experiences that start a committee meeting or that join me for my spiritual direction services, opportunities, conversations that take place on Monday and Thursday mornings at 9. But for so many of us, it's actually our small groups, those monthly or bi-monthly meetings where you meet, albeit for a topic, but really to share the journey of your lives with one another. That ability to witness and accompany, to be with, has a sustaining power. Today, we are lifting up some of the stories of how we have experienced that with one another. 15 years ago, I was in a covenant group or a small group at All Souls in DC. And I was one of the co-facilitators. And we were doing this exercise that day after our check-in. And I invited people to take the sheet of paper that I had given them, to fold it in half or draw a line down it. And on the left-hand side of the paper, to draw their community as they remember it of their childhood. After a few minutes, I invited them on the right-hand side to draw the community that they have now. We worked with our pencils and our crayons. People drew some details. Other people drew sort of stick figures. Some people felt that their drawings were so undetailed that they should label them. At the end of the 15 minutes of artistic creativity and remembering, I invited people to sit for a few minutes in silence. So that way they can notice these two images of their communities side by side. We went around. I shared how my childhood had no image of a community of faith and how central that had become to my own sense of belonging and who I was. The stories were beautiful, but there was one that really stood out. This one young woman who was born in Egypt and was from the Egyptian Coptic tradition, shared how her childhood had been filled with her family. Some of the extended family members still in Egypt, but how her siblings and mother and father were also large and around her, full of love. The image on her right was also full of love. It was of her and her girlfriend who were committed enough to buy a house together and live together for the past 3 years. And what she noticed was, while there were many good things that filled that community, her lover, her friend, her church, she noticed that her childhood family was nowhere in that picture. And she reflected how she hadn't even noticed how she had pushed them out of her life. Because when she found this woman that she was in love with, everything in her childhood had told her that that relationship would not be welcomed. And she wondered if the love that she knew would remain alive despite the judgment that she feared. And she said, I felt like I couldn't tell them without losing that love. And so they don't know anything about this woman or where I live or what my life is like, because that love is so in my life that to keep it hidden, I have to keep them so far away. We held that truth. When we came back a month later, she shared with us in the check-in that that activity and its insights had led her to remember how much she loves her family of origin. And so she decided to tell her father and her brother and her sister, and decided not yet to tell her mother, and how she was embraced and welcomed back because, see, they had missed her so much. I've never forgotten how our time with her helped her remember whom she loved and helped bring the love in her life even closer.
Hi, my name is Diane Moreau, and I wanted to share with you today my experience with a small group at UUCA back in the mid-90s. Seems like a long time ago, but it really still has a positive impact today. When I married my late husband, Bob Grant, he had 3 children who had lost their mother when they were young, and I had 2 children whose loss was through divorce. We knew there would be challenges, and we did have challenges and joys. And like all kids, as parents, you know, kids don't always let you feel their love on a daily basis. I knew I needed ongoing support with 5 teenagers. So I met with Reverend Fred Muir and explained my need. And I thought that although he could give me pastoral support, I really felt I needed ongoing support from a community who knew what I was going through. So he encouraged me to start a step family group. I had a curriculum I had researched, and a blended family support group is what we called it. And 5 courageous couples banded together. We met monthly for about 1.5 years. We laughed, we cried, we supported each other in a way. And then we left, and I felt like I had the courage and the energy to go back and tackle another month with perseverance and love and resilience. Full disclosure, not all of the marriages survived. It was tough. But after Bob's passing and I remarried, now my new husband, who had no children, now was a stepdad to 5 young adults. What I learned from that small group during that 1.5 years really gave me the patience and enabled me to support him now in his new role and to support the kids, because once again, now we were another blended family. I want to say thank you to those people, if they happen to see any of this. That was a real gift. The deep listening, the encouragement, the laughter, and the time that you spent supporting me and my husband during that time. Thank you.
I wanted to share with you a story that I have received from a UU minister, mentor, and friend, Mark Bellantini. It dates all the way back to 1985 and 1987. Mark was working on the General Conference of the International Association of Religious Freedom. This international group included Unitarian Universalists from the United States and Canada, Unitarians from Hungary, Romania, India, Sri Lanka, and Czech-speaking countries. It included Unitarians and Free Christians from the UK, various Huguenot groups, the German Free Church, our siblings in the Philippines, those from the Khasa Hills in India, various Asian Buddhist Unitarian communities from Africa, and as well as some Shintos, particularly those from the Tsubaki Shrine in Tokyo, in Japan. Now, Mark was part of the planning group, and so they gathered, and one of the things that they were charged with was holding worship celebrations that would be inclusive of this group. They considered things like how our Transylvanian siblings worship to one God, that Shintos worship kami, which is often translated into God and goddess, but a more accurate term would be great nature. How the German Free Church refused to participate in anything where a term of divinity or God was named. And the Buddhists had no theological concept of God to either embrace or denounce. So, in other words, it seemed a little bit to me like a little microcosm of UUCA. As they thought about how to form a worship service, the American planners, Mark and others, said, why don't we embrace the 4 elements? That's something we could do. That's global. It's not defined or held in any one religious tradition, particularly a theist one. So they said, let's design a service with air, water, fire, and earth. So let's define a service with air, fire, water, and earth. To which the Buddhists and the Shinto said, 4 elements? Are you daft? There's 5 elements: air, water, fire, earth, and metal. He also learned that 4 in some traditions, particularly some Asian traditions, 4 is a really unlucky number, an inauspicious number, the way that some Europeans and Americans hold that 13 is an unlucky number. And so having just 4 would be an ill omen. He always marked, I don't know exactly what they do with the 4 directions, but we try to eliminate 4 in all of our planning and functional usage. They solved this problem about what the undergirding message should be by inviting the delightful and insightful and powerful Maya Angelou to be the speaker. Wise choice. And they held these fabulous services in 20 languages. They prepared these orders of services in 5 languages, and it was moving and memorable. During the week, they were also assigned to meet in these small groups, not unlike our covenant groups, where they could work on fostering a sense of international and interfaith cooperation and strive together for peace. In Mark's group, there were some folks from Praha, a Nigerian Unitarian, a Filipino minister, a Hungarian speaker, a Huguenot from Switzerland, a Canadian Unitarian, a Brahma Shamish from Calcutta, and a few women from Japan, both who identified as following Shintoism and Buddhism. There was just one glitch. It turns out that there was no translator for this group. And so they arrived and they didn't know what to do and how to move forward. And they didn't know how to speak to each other to figure out how to move forward, because the majority of the group spoke no English. And even those who did, to each other's ears, had a kind of impenetrable accent in many cases. Until one woman kind of got up and had this energy, and she said, both in her words and her gestures, let's make up our own language. Now, at first, this seemed a little bit in left field, but as she gestured more, she said, no, let's do this. Let's develop 100 of our own symbols. Let's develop 100 of our own words, and then we'll tell our stories using those symbols. With enough gestures and some using of the blackboards, they agreed to do this, that they would form about 100 words. And so they got to work. By the end of their first day, they had about 80 symbols, nothing complicated. Little stick people and little lines and circles and spirals. And they used these to symbolize words like love, community, family, belonging, catastrophe, discovery, faith, despair, birth, life, death, school, children, struggle, despair. The second day, they each took about 20 minutes to tell their story. They told their story in their own native languages and wrote a timeline on the blackboards as they did, marking their story with the symbols in their new common symbolic language. They shared the stories of the feeling when the Soviet tanks rumbled across the streets of Praha for the first time, of love stories to rival Romeo and Juliet or David and Jonathan, of dysfunctional families that made Abrahams and Sarahs and Hagars look a little tame. They got choked up when they shared about the loss of children and how war and poverty had destroyed lives. There were moving moments of transformative faith experiences held in temples and churches. There were stories of betrayal and ministry, too large and painful for one small heart to hold alone. The Canadian Unitarian shared how when she was young, she decided and got into a college in America where she met her sweetheart and got married. Shortly after they got married, it was 1939, and they could tell that war was imminent. So he was enrolled in our armed forces and went off to serve and was posted in Hawaii. And on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor went up in smoke. Her husband's life went up in smoke. She wrote on the blackboard the symbol for death and catastrophe. She wept a little and everyone else wept a little with her. And she went on with her story. Later that morning, one of the women from Japan rose. She shared how she was born in Hiroshima, but would go and summer with her grandparents in Tokyo, where she met her sweetheart. They married, and their life was a struggle for a while, it being wartime as well. And he joined the armed forces. He was first posted in Osaka and then in Nagasaki. And then she drew the symbol for death and catastrophe. She drew a line across the symbol for husband, and she drew a mushroom cloud. She wept a little, and the whole group wept with her. And then she turned her body towards where the Canadian woman was sitting, and she took a few steps towards her. The Canadian Unitarian woman understood and rose to her feet and crossed to meet her. These two women looked silently in each other's faces, the few tears still alive running down their cheeks. And then they fell onto each other's shoulders and embraced, and they wept and wept and wept. And the group wept with them. See, our theology has a way of making friends out of strangers. A theology of width has a way of sharing, a way of creating a sense of shared humanity, empathy in the face of great loss, and even expected enmity. 15 years ago, 35 years ago, these stories are written on the tablets of our hearts. One of the ways that I know Fred Muir was such a great minister to you was he collected and held and remembered your stories. I've said for a while that I understand that ministry is writing the stories of your heart, stories of your lives upon my heart. There's a biblical phrase about that when Israelites were forced into exile and had to move around and couldn't take their most sacred belongings with them, including their Torah, that they survived because the Torah was written upon the tablet of their hearts. Sacred literature will tell stories of despair and discovery, life and loss, beauty and destruction. But our lives tell these same themes and lessons even more powerfully and more beautifully. The wonderful thing is that it's not only me and Reverend John who gets to write these stories upon the tablets of our hearts. You get to write each other's stories on your hearts. And I promise you, when you share your story, they will be carried by those who were with you in the telling of them. In fact, because these stories are so sacred, I say they do not belong to you alone. We have to go to each other like the child comes to the parent. Tell me again the story about how you survived the grief that was so large. Tell me again about that time when you danced in celebration. Tell me again when you welcomed someone into our community. tell me again and tell me again. My dear ones, there is no theology more powerful than with. There is no gift greater than the stories we get to write on the tablets of our hearts. These stories, this being with, this is what sustains us. This is what teaches us to be human and ethical and alive. May we be storytellers and story keepers together. Amen.